You ever wonder why some people have so much and, well, others so little?
Mhm.
Today, we're taking this really fascinating journey way, way back in time. We're looking at a brand new study that seems to connect the dots between ancient farming and, the wealth inequality we see today.
Yeah,
Think of this as your shortcut, sort of, to understanding a really big picture.
exactly. And this isn't like your typical dusty archaeology lesson, right?
Right.
This research, it was led by Professor Amy Bogaard at Oxford, involved a whole global team,
Okay.
27 scientists, looking at data from over 47,000 ancient houses.
Wow, 47,000.
Yeah, across more than 1,700 settlements going back 10,000 years.
Good trouble.
So it gives us this amazing long-term view on a problem that feels, well, very modern.
It really does.
And the great thing is, all this data on ancient housing, it's now online, open access for anyone who wants to explore it.
That's fantastic. Okay, so the core question we're diving into today is basically this. How did the way ancient societies farmed and maybe how they organized themselves, how did that contribute to the kind of wealth inequality we see now?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to think of ancient life as, I don't know, simpler, maybe more equal.
Right, that's a common assumption.
But this study seems to really shake that up.
Mm-hmm.
It points to some deep-seated reasons why things might not have always been so even.
And the central finding is pretty eye-opening, actually.
Yeah.
The study's main point is that, significant wealth inequality back then, it was very often linked to farming methods, specifically methods that made land scarce, and this is key, controllable, monopolizable.
Scarce and controllable.
Yeah. And on the flip side, where land was just abundant, easy to access, wealth tended to be much more evenly spread.
Ah, I see.
It really seems to come down to what was the main thing limiting what people could produce? Was it land or was it something else?
Okay, so this brings us to a really key idea in the study then, this difference between what they call labor-limited and land-limited economies. Can you maybe break that down for us?
Sure. So imagine this. In a labor-limited system, there's just tons of land available. Way more land than there are people to work it.
Okay, lots of land, fewer people.
Exactly. So in that situation, what or who becomes valuable?
The people, the workers.
Precisely. The people who can actually do the work. The study calls this free labor. Think of it as, your skills, your knowledge, your own two hands.
Right.
And that kind of wealth, that embodied wealth, it's much harder to just pass down through generations like you would a piece of land.
I see. Yeah, you can't just inherit someone's skill easily.
Right. And because there's so much land, no one can really corner the market on it, so wealth tends to be more distributed, lower inequality.
Got it. So when land is everywhere, your ability to work is the main asset. And that's harder for one person or family to hoard. Okay, so what about the flip side? These land-limited systems.
So in land-limited systems, it's basically the opposite situation. Land itself, or maybe other physical assets like animals for plowing, draft animals.
Like oxen.
Exactly, oxen. Or even things like enslaved labor, sadly. Those become more valuable than just free human labor. When good land is scarce, or if certain land becomes super productive through technology or investment, whoever controls that land has a massive advantage.
And that leads to more inequality.
That tends to lead to higher wealth inequality, yeah. Because in these systems, there are usually enough people around to work the land. The really valuable, scarce thing is the land itself or the means to work it efficiently.
Okay, this is really interesting. So how did these ancient farming practices actually make land scarce, or at least make it more valuable and controllable? The study points to a few ways, right?
Absolutely. One huge factor was the introduction and use of animals like oxen for traction, for pulling plows.
The animal power.
Yeah. In areas where this became common, to Western Asia, Europe land suddenly became much, much more productive per worker.
Right, you could farm more land with fewer people.
Exactly, and because of that massive productivity boost, what tended to happen was that fewer households could control much larger areas of this highly productive land.
Concentration of land ownership.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this concentration, this control over the best land, it led to inequality that could really stick around, become persistent across generations. We see evidence for this way back, starting in the Neolithic period in some of those regions.
Okay, animal traction. Having oxen pull the plow. That makes sense intuitively, but how do we actually know it had such a big impact? What's the evidence?
Well, the archaeology gives us some pretty good clues. For instance, Researchers have found specific kinds of wear and tear pathologies on ancient cattle bones.
On the bones?
Yeah, patterns that strongly suggest they were used for pulling heavy loads like plows for long periods. It literally changed their skeletons.
Wow.
Plus, in some places like Bronze Age Mesopotamia or Mycenaean Greece, we even have, written records, clay tablets and things.
Actual document.
Yeah, that actually talk about elites lending out oxen to farmers. This tells us these animals were really valuable assets, and their use was often controlled maybe by the wealthier families or institutions.
Fascinating. So if you had the oxen or access to them, you could cultivate more land, get way more food, and that land itself became more prized, more valuable.
Exactly.
Okay, but what about in places where they didn't have draft animals? Like in the Americas, for example, before Europeans arrived, how did land become scarce or more valuable there?
That's a great question, and it brings in the second major mechanism the study talks about, land-esque investment.
Land-esque investment. Okay, what's that?
So if you don't have animal power to boost productivity, you have to find other ways to get more out of the land you have, or to create new usable land. This means things like building terraces on steep hillsides.
Oh, right, like the ones in Peru.
Exactly. Or creating complex irrigation canals to bring water to dry areas, or draining swamps to make new fields. It's basically modifying the landscape itself to make it farmable or more productive.
So human effort shaping the land.
Yes. And these projects, they might have started out as, cooperative community efforts. Everyone pitches in.
Makes sense.
But what often seems to have happened over time is that a smaller group, maybe certain families or lineages, gain control over these engineered landscapes, the irrigated fields, the best terraces.
Ah, so they controlled the improvements.
Right. And that control, again, made that improved land much more valuable than unimproved land, contributing to wealth differences and inequality.
Can you give us some specific examples of this land-esque investment besides the Andes terraces?
Sure. Think about the Chinampas in the Valley of Mexico, near where Mexico City is now. These incredibly fertile artificial islands built in the lakes by the Aztecs.
The floating gardens. Well, not really floating, but...
Right, built up from the lake bed. Highly productive. Or you look at the Maya in Central America. They developed really extensive systems of terracing, irrigation canals, and drained fields in some areas.
So major landscape engineering.
Definitely. And in South America, it wasn't just the famous Inca state terraces. You had pre-Inca cultures doing amazing things with terrace building and water conservation, too.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, because in the Andes, the study notes, you see both these huge, monumental, probably state-controlled Inca terraces, and also smaller, maybe family scale or community scale terraces in other areas, suggesting different levels of investment, control, and maybe different social outcomes.
Okay, so whether it was animal power making land more productive or these huge human efforts in land-esque investment, the result often seems to have been similar. Land became a more valuable, potentially limited and controllable resource.
That's a good summary, yeah.
What else contributed to this dynamic? Did population play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Population growth is another really important factor they discuss. It's kind of intuitive, right? As more people live in an area...
Demand for land goes up.
Exactly. The demand for farmland naturally increases. This ramps up competition for the best land, which would have further pushed up its value, especially when you combine that pressure with these new, more intensive farming methods we just talked about.
Right. The two factors amplify each other.
They can, yeah. More people needing land and the land itself becoming potentially more productive, but also maybe more controlled.
And it wasn't just about individual farms getting bigger or smaller, was it? The study also mentioned something about the growth of larger settlements.
That's right. When farming becomes more productive per unit of land, whether through oxen or terraces or whatever, it can support a larger, denser population living in one place.
So towns and cities can emerge.
Yes. This often led to the development of larger settlements, sort of central hubs, that were sustained by the agricultural surplus from the surrounding farmland. And these larger settlements often became centers of political or economic power within a whole hierarchy of smaller villages and hamlets around them. This kind of centralization tended to reinforce the existing wealth differences. The people in the center often controlled more resources.
So it sounds like this study is painting a picture where certain ways of farming, especially when combined with population growth, had this kind of inherent tendency to create more wealth inequality by making land this really valuable, sought-after commodity.
That seems to be a major thread, yes.
But, and this feels important, that the researchers also found it wasn't like a guaranteed outcome, right? It wasn't inevitable. How a society was governed also mattered.
That's a really critical point and maybe a more hopeful one.
Yeah.
The study makes it clear that high wealth inequality wasn't necessarily destiny, even with these pressures. They found compelling examples of ancient societies that used land quite intensively for farming, but somehow managed to avoid extreme levels of inequality
Now,
through how they organized themselves politically. Their governance structures seem to make a difference.
okay, tell us about these societies. Which ones seem to, buck the trend?
Well, the study specifically highlights Teotihuacan in ancient Mexico.
Ah, the big city with the pyramids.
That's the one. Huge city, very intensive agriculture supporting it. And also Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan, another major urban center.
Okay, Teotihuacan and Mohenjo-Daro. What was different about them?
What's interesting is that archaeologists often interpret the evidence from these sites, and also maybe some Aztec sites, and even classical Greek and Roman cities to some extent, as suggesting more collective or corporate forms of governance, rather than highly autocratic rule focused on a single divine king, for example.
Collective governance.
Exactly.
So maybe power was shared more broadly.
That's the idea. Maybe decision-making involved councils or different factions, or there were institutions that prevented extreme accumulation of wealth and power in just a few hands. It suggests the political structure, the social contract, if you will, can really mediate how those economic pressures related to land play out in terms of wealth distribution.
That is a really hopeful takeaway. It means it wasn't just about the technology or the environment. Human choices about organization mattered.
Exactly. Agency matters.
Now, this study, as we said, looked at a massive amount of data, 47,000 houses. Were there any big picture global trends they could pull out from comparing all these different places and times?
Oh, absolutely. That's the power of having such a huge standardized database, the J&I project database, they call it.
The G&I, like the Gini coefficient for inequality.
Precisely. They calculated inequality scores, Gini coefficients, for many of these settlements, often based on variations in house size, which is a common proxy archaeologists use for wealth differences.
Okay, so what did the Gini show?
Well, they found a pretty consistent pattern.
Yeah.
In general, across most major world regions they looked at, the inequality scores were lower in those labor-limited systems we talked about earlier.
Where land was abundant.
Right. Compared to the land-limited systems where land was the scarce, valuable thing, those tended to have higher Gini scores, more inequality.
That fits the main theory. What else?
They also saw that, generally speaking, larger houses and overall larger settlements tended to be associated more with the land-limited systems.
Which also had higher inequality.
Which also tended to have higher inequality, yes. It paints a picture where controlling valuable land allowed some households to build bigger homes and supported the growth of larger, more hierarchical population centers.
And you mentioned settlement hierarchies before, like a main center with smaller villages around it. Did that link back to the labor versus land-limited idea too?
It did, yeah. They looked at how complex these hierarchies were, how many levels there were, like city, town, village, and where a particular site fit within that structure.
Yeah.
And more complex settlement hierarchies with more administrative or economic levels were generally more common in the land-limited systems.
Huh. So the way the whole landscape was organized politically and economically seemed tied to whether labor or land was the key limiting factor.
It suggests that yes, in those land-limited societies, the control and flow of resources, particularly agricultural surplus through the settlement system, was perhaps more centralized and hierarchical, reflecting the underlying importance and control of land.
It really sounds like this study is shining a bright light on some fundamental differences in how ancient societies were set up and how that deeply influenced who had what.
I think that's fair to say.
What about really big geographical comparisons, like, say, between the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere? The Americas, especially after farming took hold. Did they see any major contrasting patterns there?
Yes, this is actually one of the most fascinating comparative parts of the study, I think.
Oh, yeah?
They found a really interesting difference in the trajectory of inequality over time. In the Western Hemisphere, remember, they largely lacked those big domestic animals for traction.
Right, no oxen, no horses for plowing.
Exactly. So their land-limited systems relied almost entirely on massive amounts of human labor for things like building terraces, irrigation, etc. That land-esque investment. Okay.
What the data seemed to show was that these kinds of purely human labor-based, land-limited systems in the Western Hemisphere didn't seem to be as persistent or stable over the very long term compared to the land-limited systems in the East, where animal power was so important.
Less persistent. What does that mean in terms of inequality?
It means the inequality trends look different. The data for the Western Hemisphere suggested kind of an inverted U shape. Over the long run, inequality might rise, but then it tended to level off or even decline somewhat in later periods at many sites.
It rises and then falls back a bit.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Eastern Hemisphere, where animal traction underpinned land-limited systems, the trend was more consistently upwards over time. Inequality seemed to rise and then stay high or keep rising.
Wow, that is a striking contrast. So the researchers think the type of intensification mattered, animal power versus just human labor.
That seems to be the leading hypothesis based on their findings, yes.
Why would that be? Why would relying only on human labor make high inequality less stable? Well, it's speculative, but perhaps systems that depended so heavily on mobilizing and coordinating vast amounts of human labor for landscape modification might have been more vulnerable to, say, political instability, environmental shocks, or even social resistance.
Harder to maintain that control over people versus animals and land.
Possibly. Or maybe the returns weren't as consistently high or as easily controlled by an elite compared to systems where animal power provided a more reliable, efficient, and perhaps more easily monopolized way to boost agricultural production and extract surplus. It suggests the nature of the key resource being controlled, just land versus land plus animal power, might have influenced the long-term stability of unequal social structures.
Yeah, that adds another layer of complexity. Okay, so let's try and bring this all together for everyone listening. After diving into all this, what's the main takeaway? What's the key insight we should really hold on to from this huge study?
I think the biggest picture takeaway is just how deep the roots of wealth inequality really are. We're talking millennia, and it's fundamentally connected to how societies organize their food production, their agriculture, and especially their relationship with land. The moment land became, or was made into, a scarce, productive, and controllable resource, that seems to have been a major turning point, a primary engine driving wealth inequality across diverse cultures and times.
Oh, land scarcity and control. That's the core mechanism.
That appears to be the core mechanism highlighted again and again in their data. Whether it was, a surplus of open land empowering individuals relatively equally, or the scarcity of productive land concentrating power. That fundamental dynamic of resource control seems almost timeless in shaping inequality.
But crucially, it wasn't all bad news, or maybe not all deterministic. You mentioned that point about governance earlier.
Exactly, and that's the second key takeaway, I think. The study really underscores that how societies were governed played a crucial role. Some ancient societies, even facing pressures from land-intensive farming, managed to keep extreme inequality in check.
Like Teotihuacan and Mohenjo-Daro.
Right. It shows that political organization, social choices, collective action, these things can moderate those underlying economic drivers of inequality. It wasn't just about technology and environment. It was also about social structures, which, is a potentially encouraging message for us today.
Yeah, it suggests we're not just locked into outcomes based on resources alone. Okay, so this all happened thousands of years ago. Why should we, sitting here in the 21st century, really pay attention to this? What's the relevance for us?
Well, I think understanding these incredibly long-term patterns really forces you to think about our own time differently.
How so?
It makes you ask, given these deep historical dynamics, how might our current agricultural practices, our systems of land ownership and control, our food systems, how might they be shaping wealth inequality right now?
Connecting the past to the present.
Exactly. It provides this really valuable context for understanding contemporary economic challenges. Maybe the roots of some of the inequality we grapple with today go much further back than we usually think, tied to these very old relationships between people, land, and power.
That's a powerful thought. And if people listening are intrigued and want to, dig into this fascinating research of themselves, they actually can, right? You mentioned a database.
Absolutely. Professor Bogaard and her team have impressively made their entire GNI project database of ancient housing open access available online.
That's great.
So if you're curious, if you want to explore the specific data from these thousands of archaeological sites yourself, that resource is out there for you to check out.
Fantastic. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive then, it's really clear that this connection between how we feed ourselves, how we manage land, and the levels of wealth inequality in our societies is, well, it's a really long and tangled story.
It certainly is.
And this study is a powerful reminder that the challenges we face today, these big questions about fairness and distribution, they have echoes stretching way back into our distant past. And perhaps, just maybe, By understanding those ancient dynamics a bit better, we can gain some valuable perspective for our ongoing efforts to, try and build a more equitable future.
Well said. Understanding the roots is often the first step.